Alrighty, well, we're right at 2 o'clock. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Richard Keith, Senior Vice President here at Moss Labor, H-2 Business Management. In today's session, we're going to briefly review the state of affairs on DOL's processing time, give some updated forecasting, spend a little bit of time digging into options relative to recruitment based on each lottery assignment, and then spend a little more time discussing and diving into the October or winter filing strategy. I'm joined today by our H-2B Business Manager, Brittany Oliphant, and Supervising Case Manager, Kirsten Correa. We'll do our best to get through these slides as quick as we can. We do want to make sure we reserve ample time to answer your questions. On that note, please do feel free to use the Q&A function down there at the bottom of the screen as we navigate through these slides to any questions or areas you'd like us to expand upon, or just any requests for additional clarity, and we'll be sure to cover those the latter part of the presentation. And yeah, so to kick us off, I'm going to have Brittany give us some current insight into government processing times and update us a little bit on forecasting for each lottery group assignment.
Thanks, RJ. Alrighty, before we dive into current counts, I want to provide a brief overview on the cap itself for an added context. As you may know, 66,000 visas are allocated annually for the H-2B program. They're split evenly between the first half and the second half of the fiscal year, with 33,000 reserved for each. The first half of the fiscal year runs from October 1st through March 31st, and the second half from April 1st through the end of September. We're here today to discuss Citizenship and Immigration Services, or CIS's announcement that they have approved enough petitions to fulfill the second half visa allocation, leaving us to discuss next steps and filing options pursuant to cap relief rulemaking. In terms of who made it under the initial cap, CIS confirmed that all applications received through March 7th, and that word received is a term of art we'll highlight here on the next slide, will secure approvals for petitions within that 33,000 initial bucket of visas. Per CIS's rulemaking, they will not accept any petitions filed pursuant to cap relief allocations until March 22nd, 2024. Now to the question of which employers will receive workers under the initial 33,000. CIS, as mentioned, clarified that all applications received through March 7th will fall under the initial second half allocation, with the remainder needing to file for cap relief. A receipt notice, simply put, means that CIS has formally acknowledged receipt of your I-129 visa petition and that they are in the midst of processing. Please note that this is different than simply confirmation your application was delivered by a courier service. For those who were certified right around that time frame, some made it just in time, while unfortunately others did not and now must file pursuant to one of the cap relief allocations. Before we get into filing options, it's important that we take a look at what you might reasonably expect DOL to get to your application based on your group assignment. For context, here's what processing windows look like for spring of 2023. As for this year, it's looked a bit different thus far. Unfortunately, DOL experienced a lot of degradation this year in terms of processing times. As you can see here, with groups A and B observing a significant increase in how long it took DOL analysts to work through those applications, our forecasting was initially optimistic in that we were hoping that they might at least match their processing windows from last year. But unfortunately, that has not borne out in the data. On a bright side, it does appear that they've somewhat got their act together with Group C applications, which they processed in just 11 days. Of course, given these odd deviations, it makes it a bit more difficult to estimate exactly when DOL might process latter group assignments. As of the Department of Labor's last update yesterday, there are 99.6% of the way through Group D applications, and we actually received our first Group E NOAA this morning. A NOAA is a notice of acceptance. Given they've picked up the pace recently, it's conceivable they may start to fall in line with last year's group averages. In practice, this means Group E processing will continue over the next few weeks, with Group F commencing in late March and potentially mid-April for Group G. Now, what happens once your application is approved relative to your group assignment? Bear in mind, you must undergo your initial 15-day recruitment period, at which point DOL will provide your labor certification, a necessary approval for us to prepare your visa petition. Sadly, DOL has similarly taken a bit longer than they have historically to issue these certifications. In some instances, we've seen them take an additional 3 to 4 days post-recruitment to cough up that certification. We'll continue to send updated communications to our clientele broadly as DOL continues to truck through these groupings. For those who have been or will be certified between March 8th and March 21st, you're unfortunately playing a bit of a waiting game as CIS will not begin to accept CAP relief petitions until March 22nd, 2024. In practice, this means the earliest we can file is March 21st, given the one-day delay between submitting the overnight physical package and CIS's receipt. Now, in terms of what's available for capped employers, we have 19,000 visas available for returning workers. Oftentimes, you'll hear these referred to as regular cap relief visas. In order to utilize these visas, workers would have had to have held an H-2B visa between October 1st, 2020, which is the start of fiscal year 2021, and September 30th, 2023, the end of fiscal year 2023. They also issued 5,000 returning worker visas for start dates on or after May 15th. And lastly, 20,000 visas have been made available specific to the Northern Central American countries with no returning worker requirement. You may have formerly known these countries as the Northern Triangle. Since the expansion there, they've now been dubbed the Northern Central America or NCA countries. Historically, the NCA allotment was limited to El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Haiti. This year, we saw the addition of Colombia, Ecuador, and Costa Rica, expanding the options available to employers for recruitment. To the question of which allocations will be available to employers based on group assignment, we remain reasonably confident that Group D employers will, for the most part, be able to take advantage of the 19,000 returning worker visas. Some speculate that a small minority of Group E may be able to dip into this pool as well, but time will tell. As more refined cap counts become available, we'll be able to better define the likelihood of Group E employers obtaining returning worker visas. That said, for the vast majority of if not all, of Groups E, F, and G, the NCA countries will remain your option to secure workers for the spring season. Depending on your business circumstance and the timing, the decision as to whether NCA workers prove cost-effective varies by employer. Many employers opt into NCA, where others decide to pivot to a winter filing, which we'll discuss later in a greater detail here in a moment. I'm going to turn it over to Kirsten to speak briefly to recruitment options and go into greater detail on the winter filing strategy.
Thank you, Brittany. Now, for those employers who do decide to pursue NCA countries to secure any H-2B workers, given the wide array of options, it's likely best that you further discuss any viability, depending on your preferences, with your MOS operations coordinator, who is certainly far better situated to advise on the current state of affairs in each country relative to things like your industry situation or job order specifics. And at MOS, you actually have the benefit of a preferred partner in many of these countries and access to one of the largest repositories of worker data in the industry. So exploring your options and understanding recruitment potential with our team relative to consular timing will help you plan accordingly. And, given the many variables at play, and you're talking about everything from job order requirements, wages, country of origin, consular timing, et cetera, it's really best to take the time to understand your options with one of our specialists so that you can make, an informed decision. What I will say is that as a general rule, it's best to decide as early as possible so that worker readiness processes can begin in earnest. And you're giving the foreign worker facilitator sufficient lead time to maximize your chances of as timely as possible worker arrival. Now, of course, if you're not a current MOS client, we would still welcome an opportunity to have a conversation with you as to how we might help you navigate where you currently are in the H-2B program. We have a list here of some of the resources we partner with in some of these countries, all with a great proven track record of integrity and efficiency in all of their recruitment practices.
And Kirsten, if I might interject, this was one of the questions I believe we received prior to the session is, just the question around, will this NCA option remain a fixture in cap relief rulemaking? And so, I don't want to speculate as to the political landscape. Obviously, cap relief rulemaking every year is subject to a variety of political persuasions and congressional gridlock, but would say generally speaking that yes, it was a push under the Trump administration, a push under the Biden administration, and I think at this point it's a bit of an industry consensus that NCA will remain part of that cap relief rulemaking effort. And so probably would expect to see rulemaking look very similar to this year for 2025, wherein there's some allotment for returning workers. Maybe that's divided between the first and second half, and then a larger pool of visas allocated specifically to these NCA countries without those returning worker strings attached. And so, one thing I do think that is worth considering is you sort of do that cost benefit analysis of, do we want to cross workers from NCA? Maybe they're a little late given when DOL will process our application, is to just know that going into your decision making that, once you start to cultivate that cohort of returning workers, as many employers have in Mexico, knowing that that's going to remain a fixture in this rulemaking, it does add a little more, I think, weight to the benefits of, even if they're coming over for an abridged season, to start to train and cultivate workers in those countries who you can tap into should you get an unfavorable group assignment in future filing years.
Yeah, and to RJ's point, while not ideal, we reasonably expect NCA to remain a part of this process going forward for the foreseeable future. In fact, I've already had a few employers who are choosing to bring back workers from these countries so they can hit the ground running because they've already gotten their feet wet in the NCA countries. So, the timing isn't always ideal, especially for unfavorable group assignments, but it is definitely something to consider. Aside from considering things like timing and consular logistics, I know we've had a few general questions about NCA and, what the pros and cons are. And generally speaking, the feedback that we've received on workers from these countries has been overwhelmingly positive. By and large, the drawbacks have been limited to things like added costs for transportation because you have to buy flights for them. They can't take a bus like workers from Mexico can. Also consular delays and logistical hurdles, but for what it's worth, I will say that they have made significant progress over the past few years as far as consular timing goes. But timely processing, when compared to Mexico especially, does remain an issue. And likely it's due to their current staffing levels and appointment availability. Before we move on, I do want to add one last note about worker abscondment or going AWOL, absent without leave. In the beginning, this was a concern, but as you can see here, it's reduced dramatically since the broad adoption of H-2 by these various countries, and this data set sort of gives you a reference point of how it's changed over the last year or two. So, to summarize, the answer as to whether NCA is a cost-effective option will vary significantly from business to business. Things like, group assignment, occupation, consular availability, and a whole host of other factors really ought to be discussed with your case manager, such that you can make an informed decision. But generally speaking, most employers find NCA extremely cost-effective and, of course, a viable way to secure labor. But others might consider pivoting to what we call an October strategy. Okay, so many of you may be aware of the potential for a fall or a winter filing, but for others, this might not be something that you've considered, especially if you're new to the program. So I'll talk about this more on the next slide, but I did want to couch what I'm about to say. It's not for everyone. Viability really depends on your individual business circumstances. Essentially, an October filing in practice is a filing with a 10/1 start date and forward date of need. So that means that you'll have to file for the first half of fiscal year 2025 with that visa pool of 33,000 visas. Now, historically, employers with business circumstances that support a date of need in this time frame have been largely successful given the limited demand as compared to spring. But last year was the first time that a lottery similar to the April lottery was conducted for fall filers. The vast majority of employers with October and early November dates of need were ultimately able to secure their workers. But similar to spring, cap relief measures were announced, availing additional visas to those who would otherwise not be able to file for dates of need of November through March. And actually last fall, roughly 21,000 additional visas were made available to employers with first half dates of need, which proved welcome relief for employers who had those start dates prior to April 1st and historically have been pretty much forced to file for April 1st, only, by virtue of the cap. But at this stage, Moss and the industry as a whole generally believe that first half cap relief will remain a part of these cap relief efforts. But of course, there are never any guarantees in H-2B, especially given the current political landscape. So, in practice, this means employers may need to submit applications without a guarantee that cap relief visas will be made available, should you opt for a date of need that would require those cap relief visas after that initial 33,000 allotment is fulfilled. So of the many benefits, I'll say the most important one with this fall strategy is that workers who are issued visas under this first half of the fiscal year, even if they only cross for a subset of the season, like if they're only here from October through December, the main benefit is that they now are cap exempt from next spring, and they can be crossed without consideration of what's going on with the cap. Because they've already been counted within that fiscal year. So as I said, while it can and is a viable strategy, it doesn't mean that it's available wholesale to anybody. Fall or winter filers must still pass muster with DOL and provide supporting evidence and attestations, demonstrating a bona fide need for labor during the period requested. This scrutiny is brought to bear, moreover, if you have an established season and choose to supplement with an October filing for the first time, something we call an additional need filing. Of course, our case managers are always happy to discuss your individual business circumstances such that we can put our best foot forward, with DOL, but it's an important consideration to make before you decide to, fork over extra money for it. There are many benefits, but opting for a first half fall filing, if not already baked into your seasonality, definitely warrants a thoughtful discussion with your case manager regarding things like timing and seasonality and how this might impact, your overall filing strategy. And if you're not currently one of our clients, please reach out to our team. We would love to talk through whatever makes sense for you and your specific business circumstances.
Great. So I know we want to cover, because we got quite a few questions in advance of the session, and probably got a few more here just digging into some of these bigger topics. But one thing I did want to mention is, we've been hearing a lot of requests for supplements, right? Is H-2B the only visa program out there for me to solve some of our labor needs? And in short, the answer is no. And obviously, as with all things, varies business to business, but we've seen a lot of traction specifically with the specialty TN visas, which are limited to Mexico and Canada. Quite a few employers filling positions, and those do require bachelor degrees such as landscape architect, engineer, hotel manager, just to name a few, for those who have a more specialty or sophisticated position for which they're looking for help. And similarly, a lot of traction on the EB3 or green card front, and through that employer sponsorship. A lot of those, of course, employers have workers who've returned and who are kind of the bedrock of their team, and who have thought, hey, let's go about getting this individual onto a permanent residency such that they can continue to contribute without having to worry about the limitations and volatility associated with H-2B filings. And so I think in most cases, it's certainly a supplement to, not in lieu of. But to the extent that you are interested or would just like to learn more about those other visa programs, we would be happy to schedule a consultation with our Moss Enterprise team who specialize specifically in those visas and have a lot of experience navigating that process and that transition for those workers in a way that maximizes the amount of time they can be here under H-2B while they're going through that multi-year EB-3 sponsorship process. And so did just want to throw that out there. I know we've gotten quite a few inquiries about it, and also recently there was a webinar on those visas specifically that we'd be happy to share with folks as well if there's any interest there.
Perfect. Well, thank you guys. To kick off our Q&A section, we had several participants seeking some additional context on strategies other companies have used to be successful when filing in both October and April. Kirsten, could you provide us a couple of examples on how some of these strategies have played out in practice?
Yeah, there's two specific ones that immediately come to mind as potential filing strategies to survive the lottery. One of them would be splitting your dates of need or staggering them, which means you would consider filing an early application for maybe a February or March start date for a subset of your total labor need, and then you would reserve the balance for a separate second April 1st application. However, you have to be able to support that earlier start date through like historical payroll or contracts or sales data. And this could prove difficult if you have not historically employed temporary workers in February or March, because any changes on an application from year to year have to be explained at DOL, and they're going to want to see some supporting evidence. Also, to our earlier point, there's no guarantee at this point that cap relief visas will be available for earlier start dates. We reasonably expect them to, but there's no guarantees in H-2B. Should the government stick to the same time frame that they have in previous years, then we should know of their intentions surrounding 2025 cap relief by around October or November this year. So that's the first strategy, splitting your dates of need or staggering. The second one that comes to mind is filing two applications for different occupations. And basically, if you can justify differentiating your H-2B workforce into two distinct positions, then you could file two applications for the same period of need, each representing, a portion of the total workforce. So, for example, you might file like a traditional non-experienced landscape laborer position alongside with a separated experienced lead landscape laborer position. And to further differentiate between the two positions, you could have the lead position require things like experience, and you might include some additional tasks like driving or supervising other workers that, the standard landscape labor position would not include. Another possibility could be to separate your workforce into things like hardscape laborers or maintenance laborers and, split out the job duties accordingly. But as always, you definitely want to consider your specific business circumstances with your case manager to make sure that these are viable options for you moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Kirsten. Richard, one person asked, when is the best time to file for October if they aren't going to get returning workers? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think as with any filing, the sooner the better, right? The sooner the better to start that discussion, gives the case manager a chance to, and us a chance to review the ebbs and flows of your business, what we think the risk assessment would be if seasonality might be a little tougher to prove there for a fall filing. But generally speaking, we just sent those renewals out for our fall filers within the past few weeks. We would look to go ahead and finalize those job descriptions, iron out the details here in the coming weeks. Probably file our prevailing wage applications here in about a month and a half. And that all in a lead up to our July 3rd filing deadline. And so if you think, DOL averages about anywhere from 30 to 50 days to get us a prevailing wage determination. Need to get all the signatures and details in place on the applications. And then all of that, of course, needs to take place in advance of that July 3rd deadline. And so certainly still plenty of time, but would say the sooner the better, just in terms of making sure that everything is teed up and ready, such that come July 3rd, we feel we have a strong application just minimize the chance for any undue scrutiny on seasonality. And we're having quite a few of those discussions around winter viability here over the next few weeks. And so would certainly say if that interests you, if you think there is potential there for your business, reach out to your case manager, let us know, and we can review your business circumstances and give you our best assessment as to whether or not we think that's a viable strategy.
Perfect. Thank you. We have another question here. Someone would like to know, they want to proceed with NCA visas. They're in Group D. Is there any way to predict when they might see workers start arriving? And if they arrive, say in June, which I'm assuming is they're an April 1st start date, are they allowed to stay for 10 months from the time they get here, or do they need to go back early? Kirsten, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so there's obviously a lot of different hurdles involved, starting with the Department of Labor. As long as you get through your recruitment period and submit that recruitment report and get that labor certification, then you will be able to file for the cap relief visas on or after March 21st. Now, once you go to file your visa petition, CIS will have 15 days to issue either an approval or a request for evidence. Now, if you get a request for evidence from CIS, that could further delay things until you supply whatever it is that they're asking for. But assuming you get the approval first, at that point, you can proceed with consular processing. Now, depending on the country that you go with, the timing of that can also vary. I know Guatemala typically takes 7 to 10 days. El Salvador typically takes 10 to 14 days, but there are some outliers occasionally where it might take longer than that. So from the time you file your visa petition to the time workers actually arrive, about 6 to 8 weeks will pass. So just keep that timeline in mind and know that when you go to file your visa petition with CIS. The unfortunate thing, though, is that even though they are coming late, that's not a reason to extend the end date. You still have to go by what your certified end date is. So if you originally requested November 1st as your end date, and now they're coming in late May instead of early April, unfortunately, they still have to leave November 1st. So in other words, workers arriving late is not generally going to be an acceptable reason to extend their end date. Now, as far as going back early, that's the same rules always apply. If you have an early dismissal due to lack of work or termination for cause or things like that, it's all the same as before. So I hope that helps.
Thanks, Kirsten. Hey, Richard, so you mentioned the prevailing wage process. One of the attendants would like to know, can you go into a brief overview of what the prevailing wage process looks like and why we do that?
Yeah, probably aside from the cap, everybody's least favorite part of the program. So essentially what DOL is looking to do is they're going to say, hey, you're going to go out, you're going to secure foreign labor. And so part of their sort of statutory mission in this process is to say, well, we want to make sure that that employment does not adversely affect the wages and work conditions of U.S. workers here. And so what they require in order for you to submit your 9142, which is the application for temporary labor certification, the ability to employ those workers, they say, hey, we're actually going to ask that you give us more detail about your occupation, your job duties, just the nature of what they'll be doing day to day. And of course, we're going to take a look at that area of intended employment and take that mean wage based on those counties in which work will be performed. And we're going to assign you that prevailing wage. And so in practice, what that means is that that's the first application we have to submit. So what we'll need to do is understand, of course, what the position is, specifically what the duties, what the job entails, what the duties are. And then what DOL does is their standard of review is essentially to review the job description, sometimes in a rather inconsistent or odd fashion, find duties they can hone in on, what they consider the highest of, to determine if landscaping, groundskeeping is, the appropriate occupational classification, or are there other occupations with higher wages based on the duties that we're going to assign. And then we're going to, once we've identified that occupational classification, we being DOL, we're going to take a look at those mean wages in the area in which work will be performed. And then we're going to grant you what is called a prevailing wage determination that assigns you the wage that you'll have to pay both your H-2B workers and any U.S. workers in corresponding employment who are not exempt based on their tenure. And so that's kind of the, in a nutshell, we have to do it. And that can be the biggest hurdle for folks who enroll late, is you just have to go through that 30 to 50-day process before we can file the 9142. For those of you that have long been in the program, some of you have not seen any changes year to year other than the wage going up. And then interestingly enough, analysts at DOL as of late have been honing in on pretty interesting job duties and in some cases trying to push them into a different classification just based on verbiage. And, we've seen that trend, and I'm sure, Kirsten, you have some interesting examples. I know I saw, for example, and I know this is an H-2A program user, but the other day, it's a ranch hand, and there's some enclosure maintenance, of course, out on the ranch. And they came back and said, you know what, that sounds like a security guard, and we're going to elevate the wage in the position because they're perusing the perimeter, therefore it's a security guard. And so long story short, it's always helpful to have someone vet that job description with you. Just try and understand what trigger words might cause DOL to push it into an occupation that isn't really reflective of the job. And of course, anytime they do that, typically comes with a corresponding higher wage. But yeah, that's the process. And really, in most standard occupations, not really problematic. Of course, the wages do go up year to year. They get updated in July. But that's just a little insight into what that initial step is to get that prevailing wage determination. And Kirsten, I'm not sure any other practical tips just from your perspective, but anything to add there?
No, you pretty much covered it all. I mean, it's really just a matter of taking your time with it to ensure that you're accurately listing all possible job duties, talking with your case manager about all potential job code classifications that could fall under so that you can plan for different outcomes. Because, although we might request a certain job code classification, it doesn't mean that will always agree with us and issue the prevailing wage that way.
Perfect. Well, thank you both for that. Kirsten, someone in the audience is asking, if they move forward with the October strategy, what are the additional fees and implications that they might expect in that process?
Yeah, I mean, it's an entirely separate application with all fees and paperwork due. And so is the following spring 2025 application. So you are essentially paying double just to have cap exempt workers for spring 2025. As far as Moss goes, you'll get a $200 discount on your subsequent spring filing if you proceed with October. But you will have to pay both sets of CIS filing fees, one for the visa petition in October, and then one for the visa petition that you'll file, in the subsequent spring. And the worker fees will be due for each application as well. So they are both separate applications with the entirety of the fees due.
Perfect. Thank you. And I'll open this last one that I have here up to both of you. This person is new to the H-2B process in general and just wants to know if either of you have any advice for coming up to speed for employers trying to get familiar with the program.
Talk to me. Come to Moss. Let me hold your hand through the whole process. It will make the world of difference for you. Believe me, you need it. You don't want to leave yourself susceptible to arbitrary bureaucratic government officials who might try to spin things. I mean, you don't want to leave any liabilities open. You need to hire an agent who has the experience like Moss does, and you need that person on your side throughout the entire process.
Yeah, I mean, I would always say we'd love to work with you, but I think my first tip is always never try to navigate that on your own for the first time. It's an arbitrary process riddled with red tape, but I think broadly speaking, having worked in different programs, and H-2B I think is a bit unique in that it is such a critical foundation for so many employers year over year to be able to staff and scale their business. And, unfortunately, those hardworking business owners have to gamble with their labor year over year. And so I think that's where the complexity comes in is, I, a business owner, I have these contractual obligations. I'm excited to get my workers and get my workers on time. But there's a chance I may not get them on time. And there's a chance I may not get the workers that I've known for 2 years that have come to my operation. And now I'm going to have to go to Guatemala to secure labor, and they may not cross until June. And so those are kind of, I think, the more logistical challenging pieces, separate and apart from the filing process, where it can be really helpful just to have someone who's in the weeds. I think year over year, the cap relief rulemaking, what's expected of H-2B employers, program demand, this stuff changes on a dime. And I think aside from broad strokes, just understanding the program and how it works and the wage rates and what your obligations are as an employer, I think just having someone that can help you understand your options as time progresses, just given the dynamic nature of that lottery, and just further, I guess, emphasizes it's really nice to have somebody who's just in the weeds on that for a living, such that you can spend more time running your business and planning accordingly. I noticed we also had a question here, when will we have to file for February, March? And I know we covered it briefly, but I did want to again highlight. So for the winter strategy, October strategy, fall filing, it's known by a few names, but essentially what it is a filing in that October through the end of March timeframe. And so that doesn't necessarily mean only October 1st. We have a lot of employers who say, yeah, I actually have always needed my guys in March, but I've only been able to file in 4/1 because there's no visas available. And so what you see are sort of two, I think, avenues or buckets of filers for winter. You have those who are bringing them in 10/1, as Kirsten mentioned, where they may bring them in 10/1 through December. They're only going to be here for 2 months. Maybe there's an uptick there at the end of your season that justifies it. The benefit, of course, being that any workers you bring, even in that short time frame, are now cap exempt for spring, meaning you could get Group F. It does not matter. Those workers have already been issued a visa in that fiscal year and can cross again. Relatedly, you also have a lot of employers who say, yeah, I know that initial 33,000 that we referenced, that's going to cover employers from 10/1, 10/15, all the way through early November, historically speaking, based on demand. There's not going to be any visas available for me, at least there weren't historically, if I file for March. I've always had to do 4/1. But with the introduction of cap relief for that first half, them making additional visas available, we're seeing more and more employers say, hey, my business circumstances actually warrant a 2/15 start date, and we taper off a little earlier. We actually don't need folks here all the way through December. Our ideal season is February through, end of September. And so the tricky part there is it's such a viable strategy to actually truly meet the ebbs and flows of your business. Only difficulty being, we've had that first half cap relief for a couple years in a row now, but as with all things, it's not necessarily guaranteed. I would say if I'm putting a rough percentage to it, I'd be 85–90% sure we're going to see that again this year, absent something crazy. And so what that looks like is employers may say, hey, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and plan for that February filing. We're going to get it in the pipeline. Hopefully they announce that cap relief timely. And then guess what? Worst case scenario, if they don't, I'm going to withdraw it because I'm going to have to pivot to 4/1. And so just something else to think about. And again, all really great conversations to have one-on-one with your case manager, but just a little more insight there into how folks think about not just the 10/1, but that entire first half period as relates to their business. And so to the question of when will we file for February, March, be 90 days out from the expected date of need is when we'd want to submit. And Kirsten, math is not my strong suit. I'm going to think for like a 2/1 that puts us in early November for filing. Is that right?
Right. It kind of threw us off a little bit this year because it was a leap year and there was an added day in between everything. But the goal should always be to file the application 90 days prior to the start date. That's the first possible day you can file. You always want to file on the first possible day to give yourself the best chances of success. That's especially important for start dates prior to April 1st, because for those start dates, there is no lottery. They're processed in order of start date. So you definitely want to submit on the first possible day. So for a March 1st start date, the day you're submitting that application to DOL is going to be December 1st. And for a February 1st start date, you're going to be submitting at November 1st or 2nd. So although those are the days that you're submitting the application to the Department of Labor, you still have to do the prevailing wage process before that. That can take anywhere from 30 to 60 days to process those prevailing wage requests. So you want to get started even earlier than that. So probably another month or two prior to that.
Perfect. Thank you both for that. We just had another question come in. And they are mentioning that they're in Group D, and they're in the 15-day hiring post period. Are they considered capped out? Are they included in the cap or not capped? And I think this question is leaning towards, we often hear folks say they got capped out when we first talk about the 33,000 visas being met. And then again, we hear people saying they got capped out once those returning worker visas are exhausted. Kirsten, you want to touch on that a little bit more?
Yeah. Historically, capped out means that the initial 33,000 allotment has been met and is exhausted before you even have a chance to file for them. But technically, you can get capped out of cap relief as well. Hopefully you're following me on that one. But right now, you are capped out of the initial 33,000 visa allotment. Since you're in your 15-day recruitment window, it's only a matter of time before you submit your recruitment report and receive your labor certification. And of course, that labor certification is going to be your golden ticket to file that visa petition with CIS. You're going to have to pursue those cap relief visas that are going to be available March 22nd. So you should be in a fine shape or fine position to take advantage of those cap relief visas. Now, if you experience some sort of delay and you're not able to file a visa petition by the time these cap relief visas run out for returning workers from non-Northern Central America countries, then you will be capped out of cap relief for returning workers. And at that point, options become extremely limited. In fact, there are only 3 options. 1 is pursue Northern Central America. 2 is pursue October. 3 is withdraw. Those would be your only options at that point.
Thank you for that. So someone has noted here that they have received Group F the last 3 years in a row with companies that they know being in Groups A or B. Is there anything anybody can do to help improve chances of receiving a better lottery group placement? Kirsten,
we would be
or
all
Richard?
over it. If there were a way to do that, we would be all over it, believe me. We analyze this data every single year, trying to see if there's some sort of correlation between anything, whether it's like the geographic region or the number of workers or how large the company is. It is truly random. There is nothing that neither you nor your agent can do to ensure that your application makes it into Group A over another. And I bet if you look hard enough, you can probably find a pattern anywhere that you look. So I understand it's frustrating. Believe me, it's always a gut punch for some and celebration for others. And it can be summed up into one word: chaotic. It's hard to plan your business. But unfortunately, the reality is that there is nothing that you can do to ensure a better lottery group placement.
Perfect. Well, thank you for that, Kirsten. It looks like that was our last question. If anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We'd be happy to answer and schedule some time to talk through anything that you might have. We appreciate everyone taking the time to sit with us today and kind of go over all of this information here. If there's anything that we could do to be helpful moving forward, again, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you for the time. Hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.